Idries Shah, recognized as the leading interpreter of Sufi methods and practices in the Western world, was recently invited by the BBC to talk about Sufism and its role today. In his introduction to Idries Shah's definitive work, The Sufis, Robert Graves, the poet, wrote, "He does not wish to be thought a missionary. Sufi teachers do their best to discourage disciples and accept none that come empty-handed. That is to say, who lack an inborn sense of the central mystery." This tape is an unabridged repeat of the broadcast in which Idries Shah answered questions put to him by Pat Williams.
I am interested in making available in the West those aspects of Sufism which shall be of use to the West at this time. I don't want to turn good Europeans into poor Asiatics. People have asked me why I don't use traditional methods of spiritual training, for instance, in dealing with people who seek me out or hunt me down, and of course the answer is that it's for the same reason that you came to my house today in a motor car and not on the back of a camel. Sufism is in fact not a mystical system, not a religion, but a body of knowledge. Many people who aren't Sufis have tried at such a definition, but they've offered such a wide variety of derivations and descriptions that they themselves help to make this very point.
In one of your books, Shah, you have said that for the past 1,000 years the word Sufi has really been used to describe the best product of certain ideas and practices.
Yes, well, a tremendous amount of research has been done on Sufism by Orientalists and others. Most of it is buried in monographs and in very little read books. If one were to take a lot of this material, as indeed I have, from time to time, in books, and put them together, one would find that the Sufis have, of course, specialized in unburying a lot of knowledge, in maintaining a lot of old, ancient knowledge, and in the application of knowledge. They're not just hairy-footed metaphysicians.
Am I right in thinking that it's a Sufi claim that they are extremely able people in everyday life? You yourself, I think, can make good this claim. You've virtually 3 full-time careers, and what you've done in any one of them would be to many people a respectable lifetime's achievement. Prize-winning author of 12 books in 10 years, in English, that is, and there are others in other languages. Director of several businesses ranging from carpets to electronics, Director of Studies of the Institute for Cultural Research, a learned society which is looking at how people behave in different cultures, and now visiting professor in Geneva.
Although the Sufis say their knowledge is part of life itself and so can't ever be learnt just from books, much of the information which provides a basis for this knowledge is stored in books, and frequently in stories. So I have to be, among other things, a bit of a storyteller. And this is the story known as Invisible. A well-known Sufi was asked, "What is invisibility?" And he said, "I shall answer that when an opportunity for a demonstration occurs." Sometime later, that man and the one who had asked him the question were stopped by a band of soldiers, and the soldiers said, "We have orders to take all dervishes, that is Sufis, into custody, for the king of this country says that they will not obey his commands, and that they say and do things which are not welcome to the tranquility of thought of the populace." And the Sufi said, "And so you should, for you must do your duty." "But are you not Sufis?" said the soldier. "Test us," said the Sufi. The officer took out a Sufi book. "What is this?" he said. The Sufi looked at the title page. "Something which I will burn in front of you, since you have not already done so," he said. And he set light to the book, and the soldiers rode away, satisfied. The Sufi's companion asked, "What was the purpose of that action?" "To make us invisible," said the Sufi. "For, to the man of the world, visibility means that you're looking like something or someone he expects you to resemble. If you look different, your true nature becomes invisible to him."
The true nature of what you write or say, for that matter, can also seem invisible, for it just doesn't reveal itself for the asking. At first, sometimes the ideas can seem too elusive or even too simple to match one's image of what serious things should sound like. And I must say that you yourself don't fit any expected mould. You're relaxed, you're easy, you're very often very funny, and like many very busy people, you seem to have a lot of time available. How have you been able to achieve so much in such a short time?
Well, I think that we shouldn't look at me particularly as a strange or unusual phenomenon. One should realize that there are lots of people achieving lots of things, and many more people underachieving. Now there are people who achieve very substantially and effectively in commerce, industry, politics, religion, in almost anything. And they manage to do so because they no longer have the inhibitions, the fear that they might lose out, the fear that they might not succeed. And, as you know, all societies have always suffered from some sort of thrombosis. Sooner or later, people get pessimistic. I fear that our society, which is, of course, the modern Western one, is tending to become pessimistic. And because of that, people who could achieve more are not doing so. People seem to think that this pessimism hits people when they grow up and suffer setbacks in the tough world. But children imbibe such attitudes much earlier, absorbing them from their parents, coming home night after night, fed up with the events and frustrations of the day, and from adults all around them, browned off and feeling like failures. Attitudes, good or bad, can actually be caught, like infections. People are able to do what others think can be done. They don't realize that for thousands of years, nobody could run the 4-minute mile simply because nobody thought it could be done. As soon as it was done, people started running it right, left, and center. And it's the same thing with the conquest of Everest. One way out of this is to spend time in the company of achievers, not sitting at their feet, but associating in some way with people who are good at things. My own education has included this. As far as that education is concerned, education in the widest sense, my family and those who are interested in me, which in the East is usually a number of people who are well-wishers of various sorts, extending far beyond the ordinary family, these people always try to expose me and my brothers and sisters and cousins and so on to a multiplicity of impacts. That's something which I've heard recently here in the West as becoming more and more favored. That a child, for instance, in the home, if it has a sufficient range of contacts, human contacts, will develop, I understand, into a more intelligent or a more achievement-oriented child than one which is brought up in a very narrow environment. Now, from the start, one was exposed to a tremendous number of experiences. These experiences were not selected like you might select experiences for a public schoolboy, say, in order to bring out in him characteristics of leadership or the ability to make decisions or how to solve problems, because the Sufi people believe that a well-rounded human being ought to be able to do more than just this, shouldn't just be a product very useful for the administration of an empire, for instance, but should be a person of interest and usefulness to the human community as a whole. For example, one might be expected to be entertaining or interesting or capable of doing things, all kinds of things. They might even be conjuring tricks, it might be cooking, it might be all sorts of other things, in the course of studying which one would imbibe the capacities to make decisions, to solve problems, to acquire and discharge the qualities of leadership. These things, not being an end in themselves, these qualities are acquired by practice and through exposure to expected and unexpected circumstances.
Am I right in thinking, then, that the kind of formal things we learn in schools would be acquired, but not requiring the same length of time?
Yes. In the East, in the Middle East and Central Asia, about which I am mostly talking, there's a very sharp distinction between the Sufi approach, as we call it, and that of the traditionalist educators. The traditionalists are very much more like your own, and of course much worse, if that's the word I'm looking for, in that they expect people to learn things by rote, to be word perfect, to know the names of important people, of what books they wrote and things like that, whereas the Sufis are a great departure from that. Their idea is to involve people in life and to involve people with other people almost all the time. they do not somehow or other have the same social problems which seem to exist here. In other words, they don't have the same class problems which exist, or did exist until recently. Again, they don't have the same view of life at all. If you read Sufi literature, you'll find that there's a constant repetition, almost a harping, on the dangers of limited and confined thinking, on the dangers of one person dominating another, on the dangers of believing something just because other people believe it. Now, these are things which, to my mind, have only recently come out in the same sort of prominence in the West.
I gather that your father was an unusual character.
Well, of course, we in our family always regarded him as a very unusual man, but I think perhaps not as unusual as did many of his friends, both his compatriots and people even in this country and elsewhere, so much so that I'm always meeting people who say things like, "The trouble is, we never quite knew which side your father was on." And that does rather amuse me, because knowing my father as I did, I'm sure it never occurred to him that he had to be on any side. And of course, he did take a large part in bringing me up, and many other people as well. He used to do quite unexpected things and often surprised us. When I was about 15 and quite timid in personal relationships, I remember he was going to give a lecture one evening to about 1,800 people, and he had me with him on the rostrum. And he stood up and said, "The subject of my lecture this evening is such and such, and the talk will be given by my son." And I stood up and talked, and I haven't stopped talking since. He had an enormous number of scribes and secretaries from time to time, and lots of them have stories and notes about him, but he would never allow a biography to be written. But many of these stories still exist, and sometimes I go to places now, places I've never been to in the Middle East or even in Africa, and people say, "Gosh, you're the son of Iqbal Ali Shah. Well, do you know, he was sitting on that very chair and he did the most amazing thing," or "He said the most astonishing thing," or "I didn't know he knew anything about telecommunications and things like that, but he told me a lot about it." And of course, neither did I know these things. He was one of those people whom you really can't categorize, and as such it was really remarkable that he made so few enemies. He was rather a mild sort of person in appearance and behavior, but once when he brought me to Europe for an operation, I was unfortunately given a very serious overdose of an anesthetic, and I was going to die. And some doctor said to him, "Well, I'm afraid you better reconcile yourself to the fact that he's going to die." And my father said, "I'm afraid you'll have to reconcile yourself to the fact that I'm a very strange and unusual and peculiar and oriental person. And I'm going to leave this room right now and go and get my .45 revolver and hide in the bushes somewhere, and when I hear that my son is all right, I shall come out. But if I hear that he's not, then I shall come out and pick you all off one by one." And he did so. That is, he got his gun and he went into the bushes and he waited. And I, of course, didn't know anything about it until I woke up in an oxygen tent, hypodermic syringes all over the place, and having been very effectively revived. So that was the sort of behavior he was capable of, and I must say I've applied something quite similar myself in times of emergency. So it's useful to be an unpredictable Oriental sometimes.
Unpredictable and useful are the dominant qualities in the stories that you tell and that you write. However extraordinary the twists of the story, however unexpected the behavior of the Sufi masters, their actions are discovered in the end always to have a far-sighted purpose combined with the certainty of how to get a desired result. And as I've grown familiar with these stories, I've become more and more respectful of the way they enshrine patterns of thought, which just aren't susceptible to being framed in any other way, until it becomes clear that the story is the perfect vehicle to carry, almost like a scientific formula, a whole lot of related things, all happening just at once, like it happens in life.
There's a rather remarkable use of stories, which I'm calling teaching stories, in Central Asia, where we have a story which has a moral, but can also help to prepare a person for experiences which he has not yet had. Such a story is the very ancient one of the old woman and the eagle. Once upon a time there was an old woman, and she'd never seen an eagle in all her life. And an eagle happened to alight on her windowsill, And when she saw it, she said, "Oh, good gracious, good heavens, what an unfortunate-looking bird." And she dragged it into the house, and then she said, "Your beak has got all twisted." And she cut off its beautiful hooked beak at the end, and then she said, "Look at your nails." And she trimmed the claws, and then she said, "Now you look much more like a bird." And the moral of the story is that if you're an eagle, don't go anywhere near old women like that. Now, these stories are told to children to illustrate that people can be very stupid and that one has to make allowances for stupid people, but sometimes one has to avoid them. And there are many other morals and applications of these stories which are useful, both for children and for adults.
Every aspect of these stories, from people and animals to time and shadows, have an essential function in the network of the narrative, and as a writer, I'm always amazed at their economy. They are what I'd call whole cloth. They have many dimensions, but at the same time they're always on their surfaces, simply expressed and very entertaining.
They have to be entertaining in order to have survival value. This is what we call a Moses basket round the story. It ensures its survival, rather like the basket ensured the survival of the baby Moses, to make sure that the story will be told and retold, so that even if the teacher is lost, sooner or later somebody will come along and understand inner meanings in the story. But the story must be able to entertain. Such a story, I think, is the story of pomegranates. Once upon a time there was a young man studying medicine under a Sufi teacher who was also a doctor. And after he'd been working with the teacher for a long time, he said, "Master, the next case that comes along, please do let me recommend a treatment. Let me take some part in this." And the teacher said, "Well, I don't think you're ready, but I'll show you something. I'll let you take the next case." So, as it happened, not long after, the two men were sitting outside the house, and a man came along, and the doctor said, "This is a patient. He needs pomegranates. Try to cure him." And as the man came nearer, the young man stood up and went up to him and said, "You're sick." And the man said, "Yes, I am. That's why I came to the doctor, of course." And the young man said, "What you need is pomegranates." And the man was a bit startled and said, "Oh, pomegranates to you," and he went off. And the young man said, "Doctor, what have I done wrong?" The doctor said, "Wait until a similar case comes along, and I'll show you." Well, a few weeks later, they were sitting outside the house again, and along came another man, and the doctor said, "This time I'll show you about the pomegranates. This man needs pomegranates too." When the patient arrived and sat down, the doctor said, "Ah, yes, I can see you're a very interesting case. Now, let me see, you need something naturally occurring, some kind of a fruit with sacs in it. A lemon, no, that would be too sour, too acid. Now let me see. Ah, I have it. Pomegranates." And the doctor looked at him as if he'd made a great discovery, and the patient was extremely pleased and said, "Thank you, doctor," and went away happy. The young man said, "Well, what was the difference between the two cases?" I said, "Pomegranates too." "Ah," said the doctor, "but you see, the patient needs time as well as pomegranates." And the value of that story is, apart from its entertainment value and the fact that it shows us something about human nature, the value of the story is that it indicates quite clearly something which we all know, but which hasn't been sufficiently well categorized, and that is that we need time. It's all very well to have a story or a piece of instructional material, but there must be time for the thing to sink in. Now, that's something which isn't recognized as a rule in our society yet, and it's a thing which I think should be and could be usefully recognized by means of stories like this. There are things we leave out or ignore as factors in our undertakings, almost as if we were trying to bake a cake with a couple of ingredients missing, and then were baffled when it didn't work, unaware that the recipe wasn't complete. One such ingredient is the phenomenon of attention, something modern psychology has also only recently labeled and looked at.
One of the things I'm sure that you must have to deal with is an enormous mail. Is this a problem?
Not really, because a lot of my mail is what I might call controversial. If people think I'm awful, I send them the name and address of people who think I'm marvelous, and then I let them fight it out between themselves. Some of the people who write to me wouldn't have needed to write those letters at all if they'd just thought a bit first about what they were writing. They could have found the information somewhere else, or they could have thought the thing out some other way. In fact, they're the product of an educational system or a form of training which hasn't given them the capacity to approach problems in a simple and direct manner. That's their problem, and I'm not sure that it is my problem, because I have my own worries too, as it were, like all of us. In many cases, the letters are asking, at least partly, for attention, even if the writers think that they're asking for something else. For instance, if a letter isn't answered, a person may often take another line or try another tack and write asking for different information or another kind of interpretation of something. Or he might even turn up at the house and ask for attention. It's very easy to perceive this attention desire if one doesn't feel flattered by the attentions of other people. I've very often spoken to people who've come to the house for half an hour or for 45 minutes talking absolute nonsense just to make them happy, just to show them, although they don't always see it, that what they wanted was attention. They didn't really want metaphysical truths or interpretations or advice. And, as a matter of fact, there are so many jokes about that in the Middle East that one is always surprised that it is relatively so unknown here.
Well, I've been an attention seeker myself, a glutton for attention, in fact, so I know what you're talking about. And I know, at least in theory I know, how easy it is to put up a smokescreen to conceal one's real motives from oneself and then to begin to believe in it. This kind of self-deception, or something very like it, turns out to be another of those insufficiently categorized ingredients in our lives, I think.
Yes, well, you know, one of the troubles of most human societies seems to me to be that they tend to be what I call appearance cultures. If you look saintly, you are a saint. If you wear a dog collar, you're a parson. There's a story intended to illustrate that, in the hope, I think, that people will try to be something and to perceive something rather than only to look like something. We call this story qualities. Now, there's a Sufi lay figure called Khidr. Khidr is the Sufi guide, the man who wanders around the world in disguise trying to help humanity. And Khidr one day met a pious man and said to him, "What can I do for you?" And the man said, "Do nothing for me, but on your travels help my disciples." And Khidr asked him, "How shall I know them?" "By their names," said the pious man. "We of the invisible world," said Khidr, "do not recognize people by their names, but rather by their qualities." "There's no difficulty about that," said the pious man, "for I can list the qualities of my 3 disciples. The first is charitable, the second is abstemious, and the third is master of himself." Khidr promised, saying, "It is in any case my duty as a member of the invisible government to aid such as these." Soon afterwards, Khidr came across a man who was almost penniless, and saw him give his last coin to a deserving woman, but he passed by without helping him. Then he paused to watch a man who was lecturing people on abstention and praying, and he was praying for divine aid in his work. But Khidr did nothing for him. Finally, Khidr saw a man jumping for joy at being alive, even although he had a terrible disability, and Khidr did not approach him. When he returned from his journey around the earth, he again met the first pious man, who said, "Did you encounter my disciples and help them?" Khidr answered, "I had to help all the deserving people whom I met, but I did not see 3 worthy ones such as you have mentioned to me." The pious man was rather puzzled, and then he said, "Would you describe to me any of those whom you could not help?" And Khidr told him about these 3 men that I've just mentioned. "But those are my 3 disciples," said the pious man. "If this is what you have taught them to do," said Khidr, "you may be pious, but you are sadly astray. The first man was giving away money and enjoying the act, which therefore repaid him immediately in kind, and he's not charitable. The second man was only abstemious in some things. He was greedy for conversion and divine favor, and he didn't abstain from that greed. And the third man is master of certain things, no doubt, but certainly not master of himself." Well, there's another very old story which contains the same sort of insights that modern psychology has come up with in recent years, that things that look different might actually not be so. There's a whole lot of stories called the Land of Fools stories. This one is about the branch. Once upon a time, in the Land of Fools, a stranger to the country found that the branch of a tree had broken and was about to destroy a dam full of water. He seized the branch and held on to it, and soon afterwards a party of people of the Land of Fools came walking by, and they said, "What are you doing with that branch?" He answered, "How lucky you've arrived. Help me to lift this branch, or otherwise the dam will be broken and we'll all die." And they laughed and they laughed and they laughed, and finally the wisest among them, wiping the tears from his eyes, said, "Dear friends, this is a delicious moment. Savor it. Not only does this man, talking about a branch, imagine that we are stupid enough to think that it has some relevance to a dam, but he imagines that by relating it to an ancient fear of ours that the dam will break, he will make us obey him." And so, doubled up in paroxysms of laughter, the people of the Land of Fools went on their way. And the end of the story is exactly what you think it is. Now, this kind of story is not only a joke, but it's intended to be used whenever one comes across that very common phenomenon of people getting all gummed up, people's ideas having crystallized so that they cannot see the possible relevance between two apparently disconnected things which are in fact, at some level, connected.
As a journalist, I tend to ask deliberately vague questions so that the other person can approach it as he wants, according to the particular axe he's grinding. But I was a bit disconcerted to find that whenever I have asked you a question, with only the edge of directness showing, and the rest a vaguely indicated field for you to walk through, as you please, you always answered the direct part of the question and declined the invitation to make a speech about your own obsessions. Now, this is so rare in my business that it needs emphasizing. Another interviewer with different preoccupations would have come away with an utterly different content to his program. But as one of my current interests is the process of learning and teaching, I want to know this. Do the Sufis have one specific, overriding teaching technique?
In the East, it is not customary among the Sufi type of people to believe that there can only be one kind of teaching, one thing, and this thing that all teachers are expected to be able to teach. Teachers have to teach in accordance with the peculiarities of the people who are learning from them. That means that you have to have a very versatile and sophisticated type of mind as a teacher. You must not have a doctrinaire or dogmatic approach. You must not have a system as ordinarily understood, but you must have a tremendous range of information as to how to put the same thing in different ways. That sort of thing is happening here, but there has been a tendency, I believe, in the past for people to think that what I call the Eureka system, this is it, we've found it, this is how to teach people. These sort of things have been desired, and people have imagined that they've found them from time to time. At one time, people thought you learned by picking things up. Another time they thought it was by rote, and then they thought it was by demonstration. And it's this sort of gambler's mentality, here it is, now we'll try it, this is going to win, which has characterized a lot of ideas about education. I believe that the Middle East, having been far less homogeneous as a culture than the Western culture has been during the last 2,000 years, has benefited from observation and experiment, and that much of these observations and many of these experiments have been preserved in stories and in the behavior of the teachers. So the answer is, of course you must be sophisticated. There are many, many methods of teaching, and one should be able to use them all and be prepared to use them, even if by so doing one sacrifices the comfortable possibility of believing that one has an easy system or a real system at last.
This idea of Sufism being whole cloth, as it were, is an image that keeps returning to me, for it seems this same emphasis on common sense, observation and experiment permeates Sufi behavior at all levels, even even the level of mystical experience.
The popular image of the mystic is probably that of someone with his feet planted firmly on the clouds. But even here, the Sufis emphasize that knowledge must be approached in a practical way. If you look at some of the records of the mystics of any persuasion or almost any time, you will see that in addition to there being a discipline for mystics or a series of experiences through which they go, there is also a need for having certain information. We don't have many records of mystics, for instance, who had no information at all. That is context. And another thing is, there's a need for stripping off or removing what you would call psychological blocks or inhibitions. Now, if you don't remove these things, if you don't become, in other ways, practical and efficient, then you're likely to become deluded and thought to be a mystic and to think yourself a mystic when, in fact, you may have become an obsessional. Now, an obsessional is not likely to be a particularly good all-round achiever or individual who can integrate well into society. Therefore, we can produce the conditions suitable for the stripping off by having a good social being. We can tell whether the man is likely to develop weird ideas and illusory ones if he's not socially well integrated. So this is where the two things connect, and I think it's extremely important.
And surely it can be a kind of relief to be reminded that mysticism is achieved by humans, not by some impossibly sounding goodies, or even in the great phrase that you came out with at the start of this program about hairy-footed metaphysicians.
Fortunately, in Sufi literature, unlike other mystical literature, or some literature including mysticism, we do not find a great dead weight of what are really pathological cases whom we might otherwise have had to reinterpret or shrug off or claim not to be real Sufis. We are able to find and trace this intensely practical orientation right the way through. And I would go so far as to say that it has been stipulated by Sufis for centuries that people must be, as we say, in the world but not of it. In the world means that providing you are normal, you can become a mystic. If you're abnormal, you can become a deluded person. But whether you can become a mystic or not is open to some doubt, especially with modern clinical and other evidence.
What kind of evidence are you referring to? Is it a recent research into group psychology, such as Dr. Bayon's research into how groups of people can behave?
It isn't known to many people, but Dr. Bayon and others have shown that if you collect a number of people together in a room and have them meet regularly with some sort of director who is saying nothing about religion, and even if all these people are atheists or agnostics, they will tend to become religious. Now, unless this is understood, it can mean that we could have, and we probably have got, religions which aren't religions at all. We can have forms of belief which are not spiritual, but which the practitioners, the believers, or victims, if you like, are unable to tell are not religious. Well, neither a religious person nor a non-religious person would surely wish this to happen to him. These are the sort of evidences to which I'm referring, quite apart from the other material of people like Dr. William Sargent, who've often said how it's possible to condition a person from one religion to another. Now, since we can no longer say with the people of the Middle Ages that this is the devil counterfeiting true mystical experiences, we must accept that many people are unable to distinguish between a real religious experience and an illusory one. Therefore, I submit, the Sufi caution in surrounding mysticism with careful safeguards is worth the trouble, as you might say.
In the past 30 years or so, psychological research has produced a lot of material which shows exactly how attitudes can be conditioned into people and opinions can be molded in the same way. Has the same sort of understanding been known to the Sufis for centuries?
You certainly find many references in Sufi literature, including what have come to be regarded as standard texts, to this effect, that a person may believe something which is not true, or he may not believe something which is true, simply because of his environment. Some of the greatest Sufis have insisted on this. Of course, they've been fortunate because they've been allowed to think and say these things, because they've generally lived and worked in cultural areas where it has been allowed to say these sort of things, where the same sort of restrictions haven't applied as have applied in the West, where such thoughts, let alone to say them, would have been a terrible heresy meriting burning in the West. This generally did not apply in the Middle East. We must always remember the historical facts here, and we should always remember that not everything which is written down is the sum total of the information which has been available during any given period of time. I think it's a rather later development that we tend to imagine that all knowledge of any given period is in books. I believe that although there was perhaps greater reverence for books in the past, there was probably greater knowledge outside of books than there ever was in them, certainly in some cultures.
But ours is a book culture, and your approach has been chiefly through books. And they come in many forms: teaching stories, tales set in the ancient past, anthropological works, travel books, contemporary comments, dialogues, even joke collections in a variety of styles and tones. Is it possible, or even probable, that such diversity could really be just one thing, which would be, I suppose, Sufi texts in the traditional manner?
I think that's a most interesting question, because if you look at the so-called Sufi texts, you will find that they are not just theological harangues or morbid thinking worked out in a very laboured sort of academic manner, but very often they contain what you might call anomalies, poems, jokes, recipes. They contain all sorts of stuff about dream interpretations, all sorts of extraneous things which are very often not noticed or passed over by all kinds of scholars who are far too interested in trying to follow what they imagine to be the central thread, a certain very serious thread in the Sufi text, which one can almost pronounce in inverted commas. The reality is, of course, very different, and I must say here that some scholars have noticed it, and fewer, but still some scholars, have admitted it and said that they really don't know what to make of it. They don't know what to make, in fact, of Sufi texts at all. What I'm doing is not making any distinction, as it is customary not to make such distinctions among Sufis, any distinction between traditional literature and oral literature, and the behavior of Sufis today, and in fact the whole Sufi phenomenon. That which is recognizably Sufic belongs to the Sufis and is connected with their life and teaching. I do not have any recollection whatever of any Sufi text material which did not belong, however, to its time. And we Sufis who are, as it were, alive and well today, believe that we belong to our time, and those of us who are in Europe from time to time believe that we belong to the European time just as much as to any other. I think that there has been a tendency for people to regard Sufi material as the province of what are generally referred to as specialists. These specialists, so far, have almost always been academic specialists, and therefore, until recently, it hasn't been realized that specializing in Sufism can take many forms, but this is not to say that all scholars are hidebound and pedestrian people. For example, I have a paperback book here on Oriental Studies, published by a professor at Cambridge University, and it has a dancing girl on the front, and it talks about the seductive harem girl who tells all these stories. So I don't think that we need feel that there's any longer such a division between what we might call the academics and ourselves as hitherto.
It's an interesting demonstration of your practical and experimental approach, the sort of thing that you've been talking about right through the program, in fact, that the stories you've been publishing are not the ones that you first started to write.
Well, I originally started making up stories, but then when I showed them to people, they said things like, why don't you deal in traditional materials, because your stories aren't half as good? And I've been waiting for people to say, why are you dealing in traditional materials? Why don't you give us something original? And if and when they say that, I'll come out with some of mine.
Well, I'll say it now. Would you come out with one of them now?
All right, then. The last one is the one about the snail. A man was walking along, and he saw a snail lodged in a crevice in a wall, and for no particular reason he said to it, "Hello, snail." And oddly enough, the snail could speak, and the snail could hear, and it said, "Hello." And it moved its eyes around as best it could on their stalks to try and see what it was that was confronting him. So the man said, "Can you hear me?" And the snail said, "Yes, of course. Who and what are you anyway?" So the man said, well, I'm a man. And the snail said, whatever is that? So the man said, well, we're something like you. For instance, you've got eyes on stalks, and we've got stalks on the other end. And the snail said, the other end? And the man said, yes, just a minute, you see, it's for putting your feet on, you see, and these feet. And the snail said, what are these feet for? And the man said, the feet are for moving along very rapidly on. And the snail said, really, you amaze me. Is there anything else about you peculiar? And the man said, well, you know, you've got your house on your back. And the snail said, yes, yes. So the man said, we don't do that. We have lots and lots of houses, and we go in and out of them at will all the time. But, said the snail, you really are a most astonishing kind of creature. Is there anything else strange about you? And the man said, well, now, a man can take a thing like a leaf. You know, a leaf. And the snail said, yes, yes, I know a leaf. Well, said the man, we can make marks on this leaf and even hand this leaf to another man who could give the leaf to a third man who could tell from the marks on the leaf what the first man was thinking. Ah, said the snail, I see you're one of them. And the man said, what do you mean? And the snail said, you are a liar. And the trouble with you liars is that you tell one lie, and then you tell a bigger lie, and finally you overreach yourselves.
Idries Shah, Director of Studies at the Institute of Cultural Research and visiting professor at Geneva University, has also made an exclusive recording for seminar cassettes in which he answered questions on Sufi thought and action which have been sent to him from all parts of the world. That is catalogue number SS103. Two other cassettes in this series, the traditional psychologies, are An Ancient Way to New Freedom, recorded by the eminent novelist Doris Lessing, and In the World, But Not of It, a recording made by the South African writer Daphne Van Reenen, in which she describes a visit to Idries Shah's home in England and her impressions of the man, his work, and his family. Both these are on catalogue number SS102.